Let's call this what it is. They're nationalizing the internet, right?
Yeah, they are. They're putting it back in the box. I mean, the internet really started as a national project, as a military project, when it was ARPA, before ARPA became DARPA, and that was in the 1960s. And it was a national project for 30 years until basically 1991, when it became a private thing with the World Wide Web. And now we are witnessing it go back in the box, as these same sort of military and government structures are threatened by freedom on the internet and are attempting to reassert control over it.
So we're going to talk about illegal memes in a little bit, but one of my favorite memes, which is not yet illegal, is with the two astronauts and one sort of pointing the gun at the other one and they're looking at the world. And he says, always has been. Has the internet always been kind of a government thing? How private did it ever really get?
You know, that's a great point, because in the 1960s and 70s, back when there was this vigorous anti-war left-wing movement in the country, there were protests at Harvard about the early use of the internet as a military means for control over society. It was referred to, the early internet was referred to as a kind of octopus-type control mechanism by the military, because its initial use case was compiling intelligence dossiers for the military to control insurgency groups overseas as part of this newly burgeoning American empire during the Cold War. So the military was getting all of this information from our social science folks in academia and in think tanks, and it was all on paper. But there was so much of it, and we had control over so much territory, from the Philippines to Vietnam to the Marshall Plan reconstruction in Europe. And so digitizing all that information within internet, making it digital, was a huge efficiency for the military. And at the time, the left wing in this country was apoplectic about the threats of the internet, as because of a concern that third world peoples were going to be controlled by the military. But what we've seen now is it's gone from sort of a hypothetical with non-U.S. countries being controlled to our own internal politics being controlled now by military control over speech and by government control over speech, which is really kind of the dead center of the censorship industry. You have these huge Pentagon, State Department, and intelligence communities connections to control over speech, basically reasserting in the digital age the kind of control mechanisms they had over media in the 20th century.
This is so wild because, you know, the story that we usually hear about the birth of the internet, especially with regard to the military's involvement and kind of why the logic of why it was created, is usually something more along the lines of, well, you know, we had to survive nuclear war, and if there was going to be sort of mutually assured destruction, then we wanted to still be the ones to survive, and, you know, insert Dr. Strangelove reference here. And so what better way to do that than to make sure that information could be exchanged between all these kind of points across the domestic grid so America could live on even after the nukes flew. What you're telling me is it's actually more accurate to say that the military-industrial complex, the global American empire, obsolesced the medium of print by simply exceeding the bounds of what printed matter could do.
No, that's exactly right. And then you can make an argument that even the privatization of the internet was part of a military blueprint as well. I mean, one of the data points that I talk about a lot, and this is all covered in a great book by Yasha Levine called Surveillance Valley. He sort of comes at it from a different angle, but all the data points are there, which is that all of the initial freedom of speech technology that we now have today, VPNs, virtual private networks to hide your IP address, end-to-end encrypted chats, Tor, the dark web to be able to buy and sell goods anonymously, were all actually U.S. government-funded projects in order to support U.S.-backed insurgency movements overseas who were being throttled by their own government. When we wanted to create an insurgency or do a regime change operation to topple a hostile foreign government, we would pump in the internet to them, essentially. We would train bloggers, dissident bloggers, and dissident forum owners and to be able to create an independent media ecosystem in their country, independent from state-run media, so that they could organize and achieve a critical mass to overthrow their governments. And this is, for example, what we saw with the Arab Spring, which was heralded by the press as, you know, the finest moment of the internet. It was internet diplomacy at its best. These were Facebook and Twitter fueled revolutions that serendipitously toppled every adversary government of the Obama administration in the Middle East. From
Democracy
Egypt.
in action.
Right, but these groups were all getting funding from the U.S. State Department. They were all assisted by our CIA. These countries were all in the crosshairs of our Pentagon, and free speech was our weapon to be able to inflate that into a critical mass to overthrow the government. And then, as soon as a free speech on the internet started threatening their own interests, with the Philippines election in 2016 going the wrong way, with the Brexit referendum, and with the Trump election, suddenly they switched from an insurgency free speech modality to a counterinsurgency censorship modality, and we're living in basically the middle stages of that transition.
Yeah, they get you coming and going. I mean, this is such a pain point for, I mean, look, I'm glad it's not my job to figure out how to run the Biden administration right now. They do have some tough choices. It's a tough world out there. But just looking at the way in which we've become so reliant on these technologies, that if you sort of what's in the toolkit of American statecraft right now, how can we respond to genuine challenges, genuine threats, genuine geopolitical issues that need to be addressed? What's the blueprint? What's the path forward for, maybe it's not American complete domination of the entire world, but, everyone still wants America to more or less be on top. What's in the toolkit? You dump it out and it's like, well, it's taking over the internet. That's painful, because if that's bad, and one of my rules of thumb right now is everyone basically actually agrees on the facts. We pretend that we disagree on the facts, but everyone knows what's going on. It's just one side says, and that's good, to whatever the fact is, and one side says, and that's bad. And so, okay, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, but if that's the only tool left in the box, what are we going to do if we look at that tool and we say, well, wait a minute, this isn't America anymore?
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much blowback from this strategy as well. I mean, these countries remember it when we try to topple their governments. And, we had a pretty good strategy during the Cold War of building up ourselves so that we had more assets to play with in that toolkit back when we had a domestic manufacturing base in this country and it wasn't all offshored and we weren't reliant on supply chains so much overseas because we had such a robust, we had all of our manufacturing was basically at home, from the steel companies to all of the domestic labor, and these were all leverage points that we could assert in diplomacy as part of value-based trades. I sort of talk a lot about how we've transitioned from doing diplomacy on the basis of value to diplomacy on the basis of values, which means instead of doing these sort of you will vote the way we want you to vote at this UN Security Council meeting, or you will allow us to have a military base or whatever, because we are selling you these goods and you are getting value from that, or we are building your bridges and you need us for that. It's an exchange of value. You'll do this for us and we'll do that for you, and we both, get something out of it. And because we don't really have that value to offer anymore, for a number of reasons, we've transitioned to statecraft on the basis of values, which is just basically weaponizing our financial system and saying, if you do not, adopt this migration policy, or if you do not allow independent media, State Department funded NGOs and proxies into your country, or this policy on LGBT issues as we're doing in Africa or whatnot, then we will sanction you. We will cut you off from the U.S. dollar. We will cut you off from U.S. banks. And we will organize a color revolution within your country to oust your government. That is a very dirty way of doing diplomacy. And as much flack as China gets, and I'm as much of a China hawk as anybody else, I think, in the sort of Trump State Department, but they don't do diplomacy this way. They do good old-fashioned bribery. They do good old-fashioned, what the U.S. did in the 20th century. They're building ports and bridges. They're giving, they're building infrastructure and helping countries grow, and then letting them have the culture that they have endogenously, and they don't weaponize the use of the renminbi. They are not they're not doing this value. They're doing value-based diplomacy, and the U.S. I think got lazy at some point and saw how easy it was, because how powerful we were during that unipolar moment in the 1990s after we won the Cold War, that no one could stop us. So we can just throw our weight around. We can sanction whoever we want. And it's like that meme, where it's, you're yelling at somebody at a party, and then enough people start to yell at enough people that, you go from kicking somebody out of your little friend group to being the only one by yourself, and everybody else that you've made enemies out of are friends. I saw that at the State Department, by the way, when we were getting outvoted in the International Telecommunications Union by all these countries who were affiliated with China. I thought the U.S. was on top, and when I got to the State Department and was our sort of representative at the oldest multilateral organization on Earth, which is the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, we were outvoted by China. And we were desperate just to get a stalemate. And this is because China they are actually much more. I think it's frankly more ethical than what we're currently doing to do good old-fashioned bribery and building as opposed to these dirty tactics that we're doing now.
Let's try to take a step back and just establish what world it is that we're actually living in. What is the situation that the United States finds itself in geopolitically with regards to tech? You look at a guy like David Goldman, a friend of mine. We do fun stuff together with Claremont. His thesis is Sinofication. The Chinese have sort of cracked the code on digital. They're already maybe, I don't know if it's 10 or 15 years ahead of us. He wants to show people just like, here's Shanghai today. Here's a town that didn't exist 10 years ago, just so that Americans can really start to understand how ahead they are on sort of digitalization and just building raw stuff. Especially with robots now. They've automated so much of this stuff. His thesis is that kind of Chinese framework is at a breakneck pace, spreading around the world. The world's going to become Chinese basically unless we do something about it. Is that your read? Do you think that we're really facing a situation where it's sort of like, well, if we don't kind of pull out all the stops, then China's just going to swallow the world as soon as tech finishes eating the world?
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue that I was right over the center of at State, which is, China was really the first to 5G in the telecom space, and the U.S. didn't have anything in that. Nobody even came close to what Huawei was able to do, and Huawei was using the fact that they had the world's basically fastest 5G network combined with their diplomacy efforts for developing second and third world countries to be able to essentially try to swap the IT infrastructure that most of the world uses from being sort of a U.S. telecom companies to China's largely state-owned giant. And we had a big diplomacy issue there, which is that we didn't have any U.S. national champions who could compete. So we had to make alliances with Nokia or we basically had to go to Finland and to South Korea to try to find other countries who had national champions and prop them up
Samsung
as proxies. Yeah, exactly. And so, part of that I look at as being, in the 20th century, our military-industrial complex, obviously got fat off government contracts, but there actually was a military investment. There was a government investment in American industry, and those subsidies have now been completely dispersed across these, sort of social, political, quasi-humanitarian causes that have no utility whatsoever in terms of creating value. And China is focused on the prize, which is building things, the things that make the world work, the things that are physical and are not political or are social constructs. They're real hard physical objects, a real hard physical telecommunications system, real hard physical high-speed rail, real hard physical ports and roads, and the American empire went from having that exact spirit in the 20th century and the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution and with our manufacturing miracle to basically going off into philosopher zone and social division zone. And there is a place for that, but we've wandered so far into it that I do have very serious concerns that the trajectory right now is headed in exactly the way that you articulate as the worst case scenario, because I don't see any course correction. If anything, major U.S. financial and corporate firms are now skating towards China because they've lost faith in the U.S. You look at these major firms like Morgan Stanley, pouring billions, tens of billions of dollars into China, and our financial institutions, our banks. You even have the World Economic Forum put out a video 3 years ago talking about the world in 2030 and what it'll look like, and it says the U.S. will no longer be the world's #1 superpower. And as they're saying that on screen, they've got a picture of the Chinese flag. Well, the World Economic Forum is BlackRock, and it's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They're all skating to where the puck is going, and part of that is, the U.S. is losing frankly, our own internal dysfunction and politicization of our legal system, and of our trade, and of our sanctions policies, have lost us the value proposition we always had over China, that they were an authoritarian country where your investments aren't safe. Well, look what Delaware just did to Elon Musk.
It's an authoritarian country where your investments aren't safe.
Exactly. So, so as we lost our positive power projection, in the sense that we lost our manufacturing miracle, that the manufacturing heartland of the country is now a rust belt. Not only do our supplies come from supply chain come from overseas, but our labor is now largely overseas. We don't, as we lost that, the thing that we had to hold our hat on to is, well, we are distinct in terms of the values that we have in the U.S. We have free speech. We have a rule of law which will protect you, in court, to always be able to defend your rights. And what we've seen instead is this wanton abuse of the sanctions system, so that anybody who does business in a way that upsets our State Department or Defense Department or intelligence community gets sanctioned. I mean, frankly, I think the sanctions, the war that started, with much of this Russia stuff was an escalation beyond repair on that back after Crimea in 2014. But we don't abide by this free trade concept anymore, because any trade between two other countries that bothers us, we sanction.